Hello, you absolute legends. And if you get that reference, that's a clue as to what I want to talk about. But if you don't, here's a little trailer. I'm going to be talking about a very interesting Australian defamation case that had a surprising and quite controversial result. But it also allows me to speak a bit about defamation generally in this particularly interesting case, but also answer a couple of questions. For example, if you fund somebody's litigation and they lose, are you on the hook for the other side's costs? Also, what if somebody asks you to fund their litigation, but arguably on a false premise? They tell you it's about one thing and it turns out to be another. Can you get your money back? Normally I'd cut to the chase and give you the answers, but this is a very barristery situation of it depends. So let me explain first of all about the case. It involves two people, Billy Mitchell and Carl Jobst. I don't know if you're familiar with those names. Now, if lots of people are going, yeah, Billy Mitchell, he's the American Navy guy who predicted Pearl Harbor and got court-martialed for his controversial views. No, it's a different one. This Billy Mitchell is the King of Kong. He's a professional video game player. And back in his youth, he allegedly, perhaps, purportedly, held the record for both the Donkey Kong and Pac-Man. But it's fair to say there's been a little bit of controversy about that. So that brings us in Carl Jobst. Carl Jobst is an Australian guy. Billy Mitchell lives in the US, but Carl Jobst is an Australian guy. He's a gamer himself, but he has a YouTube channel where it's about sort of professional gamers cheating. People faking so-called speed runs where you try to complete a video game as quickly as possible. Now, just to declare my knowledge of this, my best ever video game achievement was getting onto the second screen of Galaxian. Or Galaxians. I only found out recently that you're the Galaxians. I thought the Galaxians were little aliens. But anyway, so I don't know a lot about gaming, but I know a little bit about the law. So Carl Jobst does this YouTube where he spots how people fake video game competitions and stuff, and it's actually quite interesting if you're sort of into also forensic investigations and forensic science. It's quite interesting how they look at frame rates and pixels and where people have clicked and how many times Mario blinks. Just out of interest, by the way, Super Mario Brothers, it's Mario and Luigi, so does that mean Mario's name is Mario? Answers in the comments, please. But anyway, so Carl Jobst does these things, and he did a series of videos about Billy Mitchell, basically accusing him of cheating. And it's fair to say he was able to show lots of stuff from depositions and things like that that did perhaps put Billy Mitchell in a at least suspicious light. I'll be very careful here, I'm not taking a side in this because I don't know enough about it, but he did about a dozen videos going sort of Billy Mitchell is cheating and showing lots of stuff from depositions and lots of things about what joysticks people were using at the time and analysing all the forensic stuff that we've said. And he made a fairly compelling case, actually. However, Billy Mitchell had been known to bring a few claims against people. There's a thing called Twin Galaxies. They're the body that record high scores on video games, and also the Guinness Book of Records. He was in there. And as a result of all the allegations, he was taken off the leaderboard and taken out of the Guinness Book of Records. So he sued a few people. Now, what's interesting is those cases settled. But he also sued Carl Jobst. And Carl Jobst put loads of videos out going, I am being sued by this cheater. Imagine somebody suing you just because you call them out for video game cheating and all that sort of thing. And he put up a crowdfunder. He raised about $200,000, I believe. I don't know if that's Australian dollars or American dollars. And as I don't know anything about currency exchange rate, I don't know what's that's worth anyway. So he raises quite a lot of money. The case rumbles on. It's been rumbling on since 2021. But the trial was the other week. Now, this was in Queensland, Australia, because Billy Mitchell sued him in Australia. And Queensland defamation law is very, very similar to English defamation law. It's in front of a judge, there's no jury, it's all the same rules. They actually cite all the same cases and use all the same textbooks. So it was, I'll link to the full judgment in the description, because it's well worth reading. It's like, ooh, that's interesting, that's interesting. So anyway, Jobst says, I can't really speak about the details of the case, but keep funding me. So people put lots of money in, but then the trial actually happens, and it transpires. It's got absolutely nothing to do with cheating whatsoever. Carl Jobst, it transpired, had accused Billy Mitchell of hounding another video game player to the point that he unalived himself, as the kids say. And he said, he put a few little comments out about that, saying Billy Mitchell sued this guy, forced him to owe him £1 million, took advantage of his poor mental health, bankrupted him, ruined him, and as a result, this guy departed off this mortal coil. That, however, as it transpired out, that was not true. A mutual friend of Billy Mitchell and Carl Jobst, somebody called Mr. Keemster, great name, he sort of said, look, actually, this is not true. I've spoken to the family. This is not, he just had really serious mental health issues. And, he didn't even mention anything about the litigation with Billy Mitchell or anything like that. He's not even mentioned his name. This was just a very, very sad thing. So it transpired after 6 months, Carl Jobst put a sort of retraction, but as the judge said, I'm very unimpressed that all your other videos have big thumbnails of Billy Mitchell saying what a cheat, what a cheat, what a cheat. You put a 30-minute video up about a completely boring topic, and then at the end, at sort of 29 minutes and 30 seconds, you say, oh, and by the way, it's been brought to my attention that perhaps, there's no evidence that Billy Mitchell had anything to do with that. However, he's not denied it, he's not come out and said all this, he's not, reached out to me. And it transpired, that actually he had. He'd got his lawyers to write, saying, look, this is demonstrably untrue. You can check with the family, they said this, and all that sort of thing. But that was his retraction. And it all goes to trial, and perhaps unsurprisingly, because there were sort of a number of different innuendos and claims as to, it was basically he hounded him to death, he tried to bankrupt him, he forced him to make this settlement. So there were 5, and the judge said, all 5, I find that it's just completely untrue. And I'm not very impressed with your retraction either, because you've basically been continuing to suggest that actually this is all about the cheating thing, but you've not addressed the actual thing that you're being sued about. So I am going to find that the defamation is proved. And he awarded $300,000 Australian dollars. So I don't know what is in Earth money, about £4 probably. Sorry, Australians in the in the chat. I do like Australian law because they've got about 97 different jurisdictions over there. It's fascinating. So it's $300,000 for damages, $50,000 for the aggravated damages for basically continuing to, have a dig at Billy Mitchell and constantly go harp on at him and not actually do any sort of retraction or apology, even once he'd been put, in the correct picture, once it'd been pointed out to him he's wrong, and $40,000 interest. And also, Australia has the same loser pays winners costs rule. So he's also on the hook, not only for his own costs, but also for Billy Mitchell's. Now, they actually did live stream the judgment. Unfortunately, it cut off at the end of that. The judge said, I'd actually prefer to deal with costs now. But I didn't actually find out because the live stream cut off, so I don't know what's happened with costs, but that'll be another few $100,000, I would imagine. So he's already definitely in the hole for 350 plus 4, $390,000, and he's probably going to be in the hole for another 200,000, 300,000 for Billy Mitchell's costs and all his own. So the situation there is, a lot of people now are very annoyed with him because they're going, hang on, you completely misled us as to what this litigation was about. We would not have funded you if you'd known you were being sued for making this spurious allegation. We thought this was all about you were being sued for calling him out for cheating. And in the case, the judge said, well, I'm not really going to go into that. Yeah, there's clearly some evidence, but that's not what we're here to decide. I mean, they did try to argue that the damages should come down for the classic, well, he hasn't got a reputation, his reputation's ruined anyway because he's an acknowledged cheater, and therefore that should go, to reduce the damages. But what the judge said there is, well, even if that's true, and I'm not going to rule on that, it doesn't really matter because there's a world of difference between saying somebody cheats at Donkey Kong and somebody deliberately hounded somebody to take their own life. So he said, I'm not very impressed with that argument. But why people are really annoyed now with Carl Jobst because saying, we have given you all this money. So to get back to the questions that I was actually going to answer, if you fund somebody and, they'd lose, are you on the hook for the other side's costs? Well, generally speaking, it depends why you funded them. If you fund them purely because you support them and you think it's a good cause, then under a case, Hamilton and Al Fayed, remember Hamilton, the Cash for Questions guy, he was on the make and on the take, to quote George Carmen in that particular trial. What they said there is, well, no, if people are just funding because they support the cause, well, no, they're not on the hook for the costs then. But you see, there's a thing called a Section 51 order, and Section 51 allows a court to get costs, award costs against anybody, even if they're not a party to the litigation. So that includes funders. But in that particular situation, no, they don't chase you. But it can come in where you are basically funding litigation because you would benefit from the outcome yourself. Then yeah, that's what we used to call Champerty maintenance, which used to be criminal offences. It used to be a criminal offence to fund somebody else's civil litigation on the grounds that we don't want to encourage litigation, and also it creates all sorts of weird conflicts of interest there. Now, when they sort of abolished civil legal aid and they introduced things like NFA, no win, no fee, conditional fee arrangements, as we call them, CFAs, and indeed damages-based agreements, which is the lawyer gets a share of any winnings. That was all brought, because that used to be totally frowned upon in this country and indeed the Commonwealth. It seemed to be very tacky, because for everything else, it creates a conflict between the lawyers and the client, because the lawyers have a vested interest in the outcome. So it's like, well, actually, they're offering us this, we can live with 30% of that, so we advise you take this and settle. Oh no, I want to fight all the way to trial. Well, you might lose then and we won't get any money. So that's the problem. It causes all these problems. But I remember actually when all this brought in, the question a lot of us raised was, we said, well, hang on, how is this? And the same with insurance, after the event insurance, where people will fund your claim for a premium. We said, how is this not Champerty and maintenance? And the courts just came back and said, well, we've decided it isn't now. And yes, of course it is, but we're going to pretend it isn't because there's no legal aid, and without people willing to chip in to fund people, then people won't have access to justice, and that's more important than the seedy side of people having a commercial interest. So yeah, theoretically, if you fund somebody, and this crops up actually a lot with where people bring the claims in the name of companies, where they're directors. So they bring the claim in the name of the company, and it's a limited company, so if it loses and gets hit with costs, well, you just wind it up, no personal liability. But in those cases, they said, well, actually, technically speaking, Mr. Director, you're funding this yourself, because it's to your benefit that this case comes out. So we're going to go after you personally. Or similarly, if you funded litigation just because you wanted to harass the defendant, it's like, I'll fund anybody's litigation who sues this guy because I just don't like him. Well, then again, they could make a Section 51 order against you. So that's why I said it depends. Now, what about the people who funded him? Can they get their money back? Well, arguably yes, because effectively, there's a misrepresentation here. You have voluntarily, supposedly donated money, but you've done it on false pretences. Now, Carl Jobst is arguing that, oh, no, I always made it clear what it was about. And a lot of people go, no, you didn't. Everybody you asked said, we thought he was suing you because of the allegations of cheating. And it's interesting this, because Carl Jobst is making an argument about, yes, but technically speaking, if you look at what I said there, and look at what I said there, look at what I said there, you can pass that to actually be correct. But this is all, fundamentally in defamation. We have this single meaning rule, which is you can't just strive for some technically true meaning. I'm using one hand for that because I'm having to hold the tripod because it keeps blowing over. We just go for what would your average person, reasonable person who's not too prone to scandal and gossip and not too naive, what would they think that you were actually saying there? It's a very interesting bit in the judgment, by the way, where they actually look at this, they talk about the video game community online and say they are by far the definition of unreasonable. Like I say, I'll link to the judgment, read through it, because they just say, when you actually read all the comments on, like on YouTube and things, the judge sort of said, clearly people who comment on YouTube, apart from my lovely viewers, of course, who is the epitome or epitomone of common sense and good judgment. But the judge said in that particular case, no. But, Carl Jobst is trying to argue a particular technically correct meaning. But, I think a lot of people are going, well, no, the clear imputation that you obviously wanted to put across was that this was about something completely different. Funnily enough, in malicious falsehood, we don't actually have the single meaning rule. So if you can point to some technical interpretation of your words, that is a defence. And in all fairness, the single meaning rule has been criticised a lot in defamation. As the courts have said, if we started defamation from scratch, we wouldn't introduce the single meaning rule, but we're stuck with it. Although I don't see why we are, because we're a common law country and the judges, the field courts could say, you know what, let's just move on from that. And they do seem to be moving on a little bit from, making it yet more and more defendant friendly in terms of defamation. But could people say, I want my money back? Say, you got that money off me on false pretences. It's a misrepresentation. I would not have given you this had I have known the truth. Well, arguably, yeah, there is a claim there. I mean, whether or not people are going to be bothered about it, they've just sort of chipped in $10, $20. But if somebody's put a lot of money in, you know, it might well be worth that. You know, I put a couple of $1,000s in there, I want that back, because I wouldn't have given you it if I'd have known the truth. But there you go. I mean, so like I say, I just found it very interesting. And like I say, I'll link to the full judgment because it is well worth a read. But it's just all these interesting issues. And you know, a lot of us now looking at that are going, you could not have run a worse defamation case in a worse manner just to be on the hook for this, because you had no defence. I mean, I'm sure his lawyers advised him of this, but I think he was probably partly pot committed. I mean, few people have said that, because the judge says in the judgment, Mr. Jobst is a self-aggrandising person who has a large ego. He said, as is indeed Mr. Mitchell, although he sort of said, but Mr. Mitchell admits that, and that's part of his brand, that he's a sort of, you know, a very ego-driven person. But it's very interesting, and it's funny because now lots of jokes about, you know, Billy Mitchell being on the leader table for the most points ever gained in a video game row about litigation. But there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely informative, and vaguely accurate. I'm sat in a really uncomfortable place again today. I'm sort of like sat on some really pointy rocks. I managed to find the flattest one, but I just wanted to get the framing there. So as always, I will spin round just so you can see where I am. So that's Polyjoke over there. Obviously, I'm back up at Pentire. That's that island. I'll just point the camera sort of roughly down. I'm sat very near the edge, and I don't want to move because it's quite windy up here. Like I said, the tripod kept blowing over, which is why I've put it sort of on the lowest extension and everything. But I do think, oh, there we go. I can't really see either because the sun's reflecting on the monitor. Yeah, but there you go. So thanks for all your lovely comments on the last video, and I will see you next time.